Something I usually don't do is make ranked lists, but this time I thought I will make one. With the way I've been doing my videos, a lot of my Neptunia opinions and observations are spread around several videos. But this kind of video is a good opportunity to talk about all Neptunia games at the same time. Since the order of games is probably not going to be the same as your own, hopefully you'll be able to see the games from a different perspective. And of course, you can also post your rankings in the comments. Since there's so many, I figured I'd separate them into mainline games and spin-off categories. I won't be including mobile games like Nep and Friends or that novelty shooter game, Neptunia Shooter, just so you know. I don't really think that fits with the theme of what we're trying to do here. I left it up to my Twitter followers whether we should rank by number or do a tier list. The consensus was a tier list. And I kind of like that it ended up going that way, since there are games that I feel are equally good for similar or sometimes even different reasons. By the way, I'm not just on Twitter. Follow me on Instagram too. I don't know why, but I feel like posting different things on different accounts for some reason. Plus, Instagram is more visual, which is nice. Anyway, that's going off topic there. A lot of people seem to skip the E and sometimes even the F classification with these tier charts, but we can't have that. I'm going to adhere to the universally accepted Zetai Ryoki tier chart, or however you pronounce that. Let me also give you my explanation of what I think each tier represents. S rank is for the creme de la creme, the top pudding of the Basilicom. The games that go here strike a great balance of gameplay, story, graphics, and atmosphere. The games will probably have some sort of flaw. Let's face it, these are games made on a budget, but there's something super charming about them that makes them transcend the other ratings, or rankings rather. A rank is for games that I really enjoy, but they just fall short of reaching the ultimate highs the Neptunia series has to offer. B rank games have something about them that stands out, but are otherwise pretty ordinary. And when I say ordinary, it doesn't mean bad. It just means, we'll get to that. C rank games are average. Middle of the line experiences go here. It's what you expect from a Neptunia game. D rank is for games that feel like a little bit of a letdown. These could have some pretty bad flaws, omissions, or may just feel incomplete. E rank games are not really that enjoyable and have something about them that almost completely ruin the experience for me. F rank is full ankle spec, I'm not interested territory. With that out of the way, I do wonder if every tier will be filled up, but I guess we'll see. Let's start with the mainline titles first. There's 8 games overall. Hyperdimension Neptunia is the first, followed by Mark II and Victory. That's the PS3 trilogy. The remakes, which are Rebirth 1, 2, and 3, are effectively speaking also the first 3 games, but with altered storylines, removed and added characters, not to mention altered gameplay mechanics. Basically, it was a reboot. Then there's Mega Dimension Neptunia V2 and its remake V2R. I was going to start from the bottom and then work my way up the list, but instead I think it makes more sense to go with the order of release, because that will put things into perspective, since I played them as they came out. This may come as a surprise, but I consider the original PS3 trilogy as A-rank games. All 3 of them. For the first game, I can't say that I particularly liked the gameplay. Walking through dungeons is annoying. You're just waiting for random encounters, which aren't really random because once you know a dungeon, you can easily figure out the distance you need to travel before you trigger an encounter. Battles aren't that great either with how you set up item usage, for example. Animations are really wonky, and so on and so forth. But, and this is a big but, I really enjoyed the story. In fact, the tone, pacing, and humor is the level all Neptunia games should strive for. Because it was the first game, there was no self-referential humor they could fall back on. Compared to most Nep games, the first game just has more clever humor. It's not just the humor, but also the storytelling. Since this is the first game, nobody knew how the story might go, which heightened moments of tension and uncertainty. The world building is also really well done. You get a good sense of how different nations are from social, cultural, and political standpoints. So while the gameplay is really unappealing, for me the story drags the game up from the depth of the ranking up to an A rank. Mark II and Victory are also A rank games for me, but for different reasons than the original Hyperdimension Neptunia. Mark II is great for a lot of reasons. While I still don't think the story was as good as the first one, it did a good job of introducing us to Nepgear, Uni, ROM, and RAM. As you may know, they are a set of characters I really enjoy, and I think they add a lot to the franchise. The gameplay is such a huge step up too, which is why it's up here also. Victory just refines things a bit more, and also introduces us to the whole idea of traveling from one dimension to another. Plutia was introduced as well, and I think she's a great addition to the cast. The massive contrast between her regular and HDD persona is also a good source of humor. To me, each game in this trilogy had clear improvements, and you could really see the progression in terms of quality. Back in the Victory days, the future looked bright. Now let's discuss the Rebirth games for the Vita and PC. They rebooted the series because of a variety of reasons, and as you can see, I ranked them in a declining way. It's not that Rebirth 2 and 3 are worse than Rebirth 1, but as someone who played the original PS3 games, it gets a bit tiring playing 3 games that are essentially the same in terms of gameplay. I also didn't like how Rebirth 1's story was devoid of the charm that made the first game's story so good. The world building isn't there, the tone feels more lighthearted, and a lot of the clever moments are gone. Also, can you imagine all those Compass Grandpa jokes are gone? I guess only the OGs will know now. Rebirth 2 and 3 felt like the same games, hence the declining ratings. That being said, I get it. For most people, the first Neptunia game would be a huge turnoff because of the gameplay. Maker characters had to be retconned as well due to licensing, so that's just how it is. On the plus side, the PC releases introduced an entirely different crowd to the series, which of course is integral to the series' survival. So I'm sure for a lot of people, the Rebirth trilogy will probably rank higher since I think most Neptunia fans these days were introduced to the series by one of the Rebirth games. Let's move on to Mega Dimension Neptunia V2 for the PS4 and PC. I consider this an S-rank game. There are several reasons. This is the most refined feeling mainline Neptunia game. The battle system is fun, everything has a fluid feel to it, the graphics are very much improved, there's a lot of cool new music, there's new dungeons which look great, and I thought Uzume was a good addition to the cast. V2 for the most part doesn't look or feel like a budget game, certainly less so compared to previous titles. It also feels less lazy because there's less reusing of assets, not that it doesn't exist because, that's just how it is with these games. V2R, on the other hand, I'm disappointed with, so it gets the D. I didn't think they needed to make a remake at all. They shifted to a new engine, which in many cases looks great, there's even boob physics, but some dungeons look hideous or lack any sort of atmosphere. The revamped, super slow, menu-based combat system was definitely not to my liking either. Is this the future of mainline Nep games? I certainly hope not. Battles are such a drag. The story remains unaltered, though this time there's only one ending. The VR events are actually pretty fun, but I don't think that's really enough. You don't need a remake right after the original game came out, jeez. They could have saved the V2R name for an actual VR-based story instead of just adding in a few events as a gimmick on the side. Also, for people playing the PS4 version, going from 60 FPS on V2 to 30 in V2R is just really unfortunate. That's the mainline titles dealt with. Let's talk about spin-offs. I already know people are not going to agree with me on a lot of this, which is fine. I'm sure it's going to be less controversial than me not putting an SSD into my computer. Let's start at the bottom of the barrel. This may come as no surprise. Neptunia producing perfection is in last place. I don't like idle things, generally speaking. I would have liked the game much more if it wasn't so, I don't know how to put it, boring or uninspiring to play maybe. I also didn't like the story. I'm sure this game has its fans, in fact I know it does, but I can't bring myself to really play it. Next up is Hyper Devotion Noir Goddess Blackheart for Vita and PC, which I put under D. My opinion of this game really changed over time. I'm pretty sure I called this my favorite spin-off at the time, but then again, there wasn't much to choose from back then. I'm not a fan of this whole self-insertion into the story. This faceless protagonist is ruining all of my Neptune and Noir fantasies. There are a lot of funny moments in the story, so in that regard I think it's quite good. We see the funny side of Noir a lot of the times. I quite like Disgaea, so Hyper Devotion feels simplistic and slow compared to those games. It's not that it's bad, but I always start to think, you know what, I'd rather be playing Disgaea. The art style is also a bit questionable. Not the cutscenes or anything, but the super chibi looking 3D models. Nothing's set in stone, so depending on my mood, the rating may shift upwards on occasion. Next up, it's Super Dimension Neptune vs Sega Hard Girls for Vita and PC. This is a crossover between Neptunia and Sega Hard Girls, though it's very much based on a Neptunia game. I don't think Sega Hard Girls actually has like a proper game, just like cameos in other ones. I give this one a C, even though there are some really great things about Super Dimension. This time the main protagonist is actually IF. The world is really jumbled up in this game. Not only do none of the goddesses know each other, you also travel through several eras and meet the Neptunia goddesses who are paired against their Sega Hard Girls equivalent. I think this is the first time actual console name brands and models have been mentioned in a Neptunia game. One of my favorite things about Neptune vs. Sega Hard Girls, other than Iffy's new outfit, is how the characters interact. They keep taking shots at each other during their conversations, yet the tone remains kinda lighthearted still. It's like they're on a British comedy panel show or something. But there are things I don't like. The way the battle system works just isn't to my liking at all, with the charging and all that stuff. It's quite cumbersome. The platforming elements are also very clunky, not to mention Compa isn't in the game. How could they just split the pair? So yeah, that's kinda disappointing. The story shenanigans are B and A territory for me, but there's gameplay stuff that brings it down to a C. The next game is also a C. It's Mega Tag Mention Blonde plus Neptune vs. Zombies for the Vita and PC. You're gonna hear the words for the Vita and PC a lot in this spin-off section. This is a hack and slash sort of sequel to Neptunia U. I say sort of sequel because it's not a sequel story-wise, it's its own thing, but it is a sequel in regards to the gameplay. In some ways, I feel like it is an improvement over Nep U, but overall I think Mega Tag Mention doesn't flow as nicely in battle. So that's why it's a C, which isn't bad. Some things I am fond of is the change of setting and also the art style in the menus and overlays. I think it's really cool to see something that you'd never see in a regular Neptunia game. And now it's time to talk about Neptunia U Action Unleashed, the predecessor of the game we just talked about. I put it under the B ranking. Nep U is in many ways quite simplistic. It's not a long game at all, but I appreciate the approach. I can just turn it on, do a few missions, turn it off. It reminds me of some of the older arcade games where you don't really get that many game modes, but unlike most of those, Nep U is actually pretty easy, which I'm fine with. It's satisfying to play, and I don't really need to invest any sort of brain power to play it. Sometimes that's all I want. Cyber Dimension Neptunia 4 Goddesses Online for the PS4 and PC gets an A for me. I'm sure there are people who don't agree with me on that at all. There's a lot of bugs, especially with the PS4 game, which is, in terms of performance, really quite all over the place. There's also really odd behaving AI, and the online multiplayer is horrific. But the game looks absolutely fantastic. The real-time combat is really fun, the dungeons are all new and look great. Overall, it's just a nice thing to look at. I also like the novelty factor of the much and often overused fantasy role-playing setting being used here. I think there are some missed opportunities other than what I just mentioned earlier. I think they should have had the goddess versions of the Little Sisters, just like they did with the original Gang of Four. Iffy, Compa, and all the other CPUs from the other main games are also not playable, which is a shame. One of the fun things is to see what kind of classes they have in a fantasy setting. Sometimes it matches whatever they're in, in real life. Other times it's more reflective of what a character wants to be like rather than what they're actually like. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic I like to see. I really hope Tamsoft keeps at it and comes up with something more polished and refined. The last game on this list is Super Neptunia RPG for the Nintendo Switch, PC, and PS4. This is probably another unpopular opinion, but for me, Neptunia RPG is an S-rank game. Yes, it has wonky animations, which the normal 3D games have as well, I should add, but I guess people aren't used to 2D graphics outside of mobile games, hence why people always say it looks like a mobile game. But I really like the art style. The battle system I found pretty fun too. It's just hard enough that you can't breeze through it, at least for me. The different environments are really nice to look at. The character animations really add something to the cutscenes that you don't ever experience with the 2D visual novel style ones. And perhaps most importantly, the story feels very close to the original PS3 game from all those years ago. Because the game doesn't rely on a setting that's already established, it all feels fresh and new. They changed it enough that it's slightly familiar, but somehow almost all new. There are things I wish were different though. I already mentioned the weird animations. Platforming can be a bit difficult to figure out because it's not always clear exactly where the edges of a platform are. Sometimes it's not even the edges. In towns and cities, you just don't know what is or isn't something you can jump on. So there's some trial and error, which isn't particularly fun. While there are characters you can play as that aren't the 4 goddesses, it would have been great if the Little Sisters were there too. I'm not sure how they would have integrated them into the story, but even just as unlockable characters. Let's be honest though, they'd never be unlockable. They would have been released as a DLC or something, but even so, I think it would have been great to see them in this game. So that's how I would rank all the Neptunia mainline games and spin-offs. I thought it was pretty fun being able to talk about all the games in one go. I noticed that we didn't even end up using the E ranking, but whatever. I didn't feel any of the games fit into that particular classification. Let me know if you want to see something similar with other franchises. Since Neptunia, Disgaea, and Senran Kagura is this channel's holy trinity, you'll probably see ranking videos on the other two franchises. But give me some suggestions for other franchises too. Or perhaps they don't need to be franchises. It could be some sort of other category. Something I will say is that I will never do any character tier rankings. I just find the idea off-putting having to rank people, even if they are fictional. So let me know in the comments what you think. If you liked the video and like the types of videos I do, please consider helping the channel out on Patreon, like these fine people here on screen. I've done some behind-the-scenes videos recently that Patreon members can watch. For example, I recently talked about some lost YSN videos, footage, and video ideas. I also talked about my approach on thumbnails and things like that. So if you're into that, you can find all the info on the Patreon page. All the links to that and more can be found in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.